All right, everybody. All right, everybody. Settle down. Settle down. Settle down. Thank you. I'll be your teacher for today. My name is Mr. Dwight. We've got a few things to go over today in this week's episode of Dwight's Bites. So we alluded to this particular piece of business that we had heard about, we had mentioned on the last Patreon episode, and it was brought to me by a colleague on Twitter named Cpunk, at Cpunk, Seepvnk, and it was a very curious article, and I would like to present it to you now. I don't think, this was certainly news to me, and it certainly was not broadcast on the corporate media, or at least if it was, I certainly wasn't alerted to it, and I kind of tend to know many of the comings and goings and such, but this was pretty rough, and I think we should talk about it. So I'm going to read from the Oregon Live, the Oregonian? Somebody correct me. Somebody don't correct me. Somebody DM Shane. And the title of the article, it came out last week, came out the 14th of August. The title of the article is Facebook Abandons Broken Drilling Equipment Under Oregon Coast Seafloor. And it's got just a picture here of the absolutely gorgeous, picturesque Pacific coastline here. And it says, an aerial photo shows the lot where Facebook was drilling earlier this year to connect a high-speed fiber optic cable to the Asian continent. After an incident in April, more than 1,000 feet of drilling pipe and 6,500 gallons of drilling fluid were abandoned beneath the seafloor. So let's read this here. Lene Rutledge was worried when she heard Facebook planned to build a landing spot for an underground fiber optic cable near her Oregon coast home. Tierra del Mar, where the 70-year-old retired government worker lives part-time, is a tiny community north of Pacific City with no stoplights, no cell phone service. The enclave, all zoned residential, consists of about a dozen mostly gravel streets running perpendicular to an idyllic stretch of beach, each lined with single-family homes. Lovely. Rutledge and many of her neighbors worried about heavy equipment on fragile roads built over sand dunes. They worried about noise and vibrations from the drill needed to punch a hole under the seafloor thousands of feet into the ocean. They worried about threatened bird species like the snowy plover and the marbled murrelet that could be affected. Despite their concerns and a vocal campaign to stop the project, construction began earlier this year. Oh, capital is not an easy foe to come across. Then, on April 28th, the drilling crew hit an unexpected area of hard rock. The drill bit became lodged and the drill pipe snapped 50 feet below the seafloor. The crew was able to recover some of the equipment, but they left the rest where it lay. Today, about 1,100 feet of pipe, a drill tip, various other tools, and 6,500 gallons of drilling fluid sit under the seafloor just off the central Oregon coast. Facebook has no plans to retrieve the equipment. Edge Cable Holdings, a Facebook subsidiary responsible for the project, notified the county of the accident on May 5th, but it did not explicitly mention the abandoned equipment. That information didn't emerge until a meeting with state officials June 17th, nearly 2 months after the malfunction. The delay in the notification eliminated any potential options for recovery of the equipment, said Allie Hansen, a Department of State Land spokeswoman. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said the company's new plan is to return in 2021 to drill a new hole, leaving the lost equipment under the seafloor indefinitely. So let's just pause here for a second, because it's a lot to take in. But the bottom line is, Facebook is trying to create their own Giga network. I just made that word up, but it sounded cool and technological. They're trying to create their own network, because keep in mind, too, if you're not familiar, the continents on Earth and various islands and stuff like that are connected to the internet with literal physical cables, right? The electricity, then the information that goes through them moves at the speed of light, and that's how we can text each other on WhatsApp and stuff from here to, Hong Kong, whatever. And it's pretty remarkable. It's pretty amazing. That is done by literal cables on the seafloor crossing the different crossing the oceans. So this isn't unique necessarily, or certainly isn't exactly pioneering for a private company, a large multinational conglomerate, a mega monopoly or an oligopolist to do something like this. If I recall, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but Goldman Sachs, I think, created their own dedicated line between their Chicago office and their New York office to be able to beat other competitors, other traders and markets by milliseconds, nanoseconds we're talking about here. So instead of going through a commonly shared line that they needed to use for, that everybody else uses, they literally created their own physical line. And of course, as we know now, many stock transactions and trades are done automatically. So there's, aside from the different algorithms that they create for trading, there's very little advantage you can get to beat the market unless you beat the market there, which is exactly what they did. So I don't know exactly for sure what Facebook's plan is with this, but any amount of millisecond of speed or dedicated line or just anything, a privatization of the fucking internet would be in their best interest. And in order to do this, they need to create that physical infrastructure, and they're doing it in a way that is fucking up the environment. It's not to say that this is like, the actual drilling material. It's not like an oil spill. I'm sure there are worse spills and worse industrial disasters that have occurred, but it's just fucking, you wouldn't expect it from Facebook, a website. But again, what is this exposing? That this is not what it's about, right? It's about the kind of psycho manifest destiny that these multinational conglomerate technology companies have. Let's just keep reading a little bit here. But I think we already got the gist, but let's see what else they got. A Facebook spokeswoman confirmed the drilling equipment remains below the seafloor just off the coast, but disputed the timeline when the state was notified. She said the company was aware of the May 5th letter that had been passed to officials by a resident and followed up with a phone call with the State Department of Lands 2 days later. How fucking petty. How petty is that? It's petty as shit. Oh, well, we called them. Like, to pit to pit a enormous tech conglomerate owned by one of the richest men on earth against, a rural, no cell phone service area of coastal Oregon. It's just insane to me. Anyway, she said the company had performed an environmental assessment and determined that there is no negative environmental or public health impact for the drill head remaining at the site. Says you. Again, yeah, it might not, cause the death of what was the sweet little bird there that they were talking about, the plover, the snowy plover. Yeah, it might not cause the death of the entire species, but it doesn't. The normalization of industrial accidents by tech companies is a terrifying precedent to set, I would say. Yeah, so there's a lot more to this article that was very nicely written by Cale Williams of the Oregonian. But, I think we've said what we need to say already about this. At the end of the day, it's a very spooky precedent to set when a private oligopolist is trying to make these industrial accidents passé, especially for one that's, that's doing so for a very weird and privatizing kind of manifest destiny that they're doing. So I'm glad we were able to talk about this particular item of business. So the next item of business is something that I think we all need to pay a little bit of attention to, because I think it was completely underwhelmingly covered by the corporate media and at least television media. And we're going to read from something. I actually agree with the title of this Washington Post article that came out also on August 14th that was by Liz Lenz, who's actually a columnist in Iowa. And the title of the article is "An Inland Hurricane Tore Through Iowa. You Probably Didn't Hear About It." And there's a picture I'm looking at here of some grain silos, and the caption of the picture says, "A drone image shows damaged grain bins by the Heartland Co-op grain elevator on August 11th in Luther, Iowa." Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds said early estimates indicate that 10 million acres, nearly a third of the state land used for crops, were damaged when a powerful storm battered the region a day earlier. Fuck. On Monday, Iowa was leveled by what amounted to a Category 2 hurricane. But you wouldn't know that from reading, listening, or watching the news. While the storm did garner some coverage, mostly via wire stories, its impact remains underreported days later. The dispatches focused on crop damage and electric outages have been shouted down by the coverage of the Veepstakes and the fate of college football. Veepstakes, Jesus. Conservatives' consternation over the new Cardi B single has... please. Could have done without that. Has gotten more attention than Iowans left without power or food for what may be weeks. And all this as the pandemic continues to wreak havoc throughout the state. Iowa's last disaster, breathlessly covered by the media, was the caucuses. Yes. After that, everyone moved out. The dearth of coverage means we're struggling here and no one knows. The storm was called a derecho, a term for sustained straight-line winds. As local TV news anchor Beth Maliki tweeted Wednesday, this isn't a few trees down and the inconvenience of power going out. It's like a tornado hit whole counties. Gusts of 112 miles an hour were recorded in Lynn County. As I drove through the town of Cedar Rapids on Monday, I saw billboards bent in half, whole buildings collapsed, trees smashed through roofs and windows. The scope and breadth of the disaster is still being calculated, but by some estimates, more than 10 million acres, or 43% of the state's soybean and corn crops have been damaged. Wow. Whoa. I mean, just reading into that one paragraph of 43%, half, let's just say half of the state's soybean and corn crops have been damaged. You know, what are the downstream effects in the supply chain of raw materials, you know, agribusinesses, raw materials being wiped out or damaged or whatever, disrupted anyway? I mean, what does corn go into? Fucking everything. Half of a grocery store is made of corn. Like the entire cereal aisle is corn. Ethanol is usually a 10% ethanol additive to gasoline, which isn't good for cars, but it's cheaper than gas or whatever in some ways. Ethanol is a huge portion of the supply chain of how we go with fossil fuels, right? I guess technically that's a biofuel, but whatever. Soybeans, I assume that they're important in some ways. I know that soy is used in a lot of things, including faces and pictures, but let's keep on moving here. 250,000 Iowans are still without power. In Lynn County, where I live, 79% of people are without power, still 3 days after the disaster. Cell service is spotty where it exists. The few gas stations and grocery stores with power only take cash, and good luck getting cash from your bank, which is most likely closed. Even if you have the money, lines snake around the gas stations 2 hours long or more, and grocery stores are chaos. A citywide curfew exists, and you can see the Milky Way from the darkened downtown. That's Cedar Rapids, Jesus. My friend Ben Kaplan, a local photographer and videographer, described the situation this way. There's no trash pickup. There are 100,000 fridges of rotting food. There are raccoons. There's no escape from the heat except to run out of town to look for basic supplies in an air-conditioned car. Downtown, bricks and glass litter the sidewalks. Plate glass windows shattered during the storm. Many businesses have been physically destroyed. All restaurants lost off all of their perishables. Factories are closed. Offices are closed. The economy, the whole thing is stopped. All of the destruction is compounded by complications from the pandemic, which make cleanup, charging stations, and distributing meals all the more difficult. And yet, unless you were living here, you wouldn't know. And she makes a really good point here, which, again, we can't beat the drum enough about how important local reporting is and how the business model of corporate media is just completely deleterious from our understanding of what's actually going on the ground, instead of creating sensationalist media that can just be sold by advertising, blah, 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 blah. Okay, you get it. Local newsrooms already gutted by years of downsizing and cutbacks, stretched thinned by pandemic coverage, are scrambling, barely able to get out updates. Senior visual journalist Liz Martin's car was hit by debris and she had to walk the streets after the storm taking pictures. She uploaded them at the printing warehouse as power and internet flickered on and off and her phone battery died. Local TV news station KCRG had journalists riding out the storm in their cars, unable to use their phones to call in updates. This is fucking terrifying. At my own newspaper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, we struggled without internet and ran our printing warehouse on a generator. The business editor told me he was driving over with flash drives with stories on them from a nearby town, Iowa City, to plug them directly into our printer server. Jesus Christ. I'm just gonna skip along a little. Oh no, but this is interesting. The few news stories that have been picked up are wire stories. We wrote them. Meanwhile, the national and local media covered Hurricane Isaias every day for a week. It's true. And not to mention that, not that we need to downplay the severity of it. I mean, there's still the entire state of fucking Connecticut was like out of power for a week. Parts of Jersey Shore, up in Vermont and upstate New York and shit. It's insane. I'm just going to read this second part here, and then I think there's a really important point that we need to make. So far, the only elected leader calling for a presidential disaster declaration is Representative Abby Finkenauer, who tweeted, "We need more resources, and we need them now. The governor needs to call for a presidential disaster declaration, and the president needs to grant it. Hundreds of thousands still without power. We need assistance in all forms now. She repeated this call at a news conference, pointing out the mothers who cannot freeze breast milk and cancer patients who can't access their medicine. What the fuck? Governor Kim Reynolds and Republican Senator Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst have toured some disaster sites, focusing on crop damage, of course, because that's their fucking property of their donors, but have remained silent when it comes to demanding national help. Both have plans to come to Cedar Rapids in Lynn County 4 full days after the devastating storm. Even if they eventually take up calls for help, it will have come belatedly, leaving hundreds of thousands to sit in their homes without power, without food, struggling for access to and coordinate help. If only we had a federal agency, something that was able to do emergency management. I would call it like, I don't know, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. We're so unprepared for climate change. I mean, I'm not saying that this is specifically due to climate change. I'm not a meteorologist. I'm not a climate scientist. I don't know. But like with Isaias that came through the East Coast that we lived through here in New York City, like it was fucking bizarre. I went, firstly, it blew through so fast, and there was a huge amount of rain, but it wasn't even the rain that did it. Just the winds were devastating, and every street was just lined with downed branches and stuff like that. I went through Prospect Park, and I went through Central Park, and the amount of limbs and trees that were downed is just unbelievable. Where do you, even if you get crews out, tree surgeons and such to go out there and fix them up and chip this stuff, like what do you even do with all those wood chips? I'm sure there's some like municipal good that they can use this for like parks and stuff like that, but just the sheer volume, not to mention like the devastation done to the trees and such. And what was weird too was I took a ride on a bike. I went to Lower Manhattan to check out like what had happened and the damage, and the city put a fucking condom around Lower Manhattan. I say that, as a joke, but I mean, there was this barrier of like sandbags and this weird like tube that was like 6 feet in diameter that was used to prevent like, a storm surge from coming up and flooding parts of Lower Manhattan. Obviously, there's something to be said that there's like, it's a floodplain issue down there in Lower Manhattan because it's very low to the sea level, but there's Capitol is down there, right? The Federal Reserve is down there. Like that's who the city is going to prepare for, not to mention all the people that were out of power in the area. And that there's a whole other conversation to be said about like, having our power grids and power systems municipalized so that there's not driven by a profit motive in order to restore power to all us. There needs some civilian oversight, civic oversight. But anyway, it blew through so quick. And I was just like, I've never experienced anything like this in my short decades on this planet. And thinking about what happened in Iowa, like we're just so not prepared for climate change, because the go-to like the trigger actions that we take is like protect capital. Those that have means to buy a generator, well, they'll be fine. It rewards those who have the means in the first place to protect themselves and leaves the rest of us out to dry or to be blown apart with 113 mile an hour winds like they had in Iowa. We just are so underprepared for climate change and the severity of the weather that's going to come with it, because as we've said a lot of times on the program, it is going to impact different parts of the world differently. And it's not necessarily, yes, there is a larger trend of global warming overall as an average, but those environmental factors that are being exacerbated, those severe weather patterns are being they set a record in Death Valley. It was 130 degrees Fahrenheit. That's unbelievable. Like, how do you die? You just die. You wither and you turn into a raisin, or your skin is sun bleached. I mean, we're getting macabre here, but the point is we are completely underprepared for this stuff. And as we've seen, does the president want to make a concession to say like, hey, we need to turn this into a disaster zone? No, because that would mean creating available funds to help the layman, to help us, to help the working class. And obviously, as we saw there, what were the priorities for the leadership in the federal and state level? Which was we gotta look after the crops again. They're donors. right? Who owns those crops? Who owns agribusiness in the Midwest? Large, insane multinational conglomerates, large multinational agribusiness firms. Yeah, a little spooky here, folks. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today, and I hope you appreciate this. I woke up to this article today. Today I'm recording this on Wednesday, August 19th. And it's an article that came out yesterday that I feel it in the back of my throat, even as I'm talking about it right now. CNN article, and I'll just read the title, and I think you'll understand why I feel the gravity of this. The title is Black Newborns 3 times more likely to die when looked after by white doctors. And I'll just read the beginning of the article here. Black newborn babies in the United States are more likely to survive childbirth if they are cared for by black doctors, but 3 times more likely to die when looked after by white doctors, a study has found. The mortality rate of black newborns shrunk by between 39 and 58% when black physicians took charge of the birth. I'm going to say that again. The mortality rate, which is the rate at which, newborns die, the mortality rate shrunk between, let's just call it 40 and 60% when black physicians took charge of the birth, which laid bare how shocking racial disparities in human health can affect even the first hours of a person's life. By contrast, the mortality rate for white babies was largely unaffected by a doctor's race. So, for instance, if you had a doctor that was not white, the white child still received par levels of care. The findings support previous research which has shown that while infant mortality rates have fallen in recent decades, black children remain significantly more likely to die early than their white counterparts. Now, in case you were wondering, okay, but how wide, how big of a study was this? I'll tell you. Researchers from George Mason University analyzed data capturing 1.8 million hospital births in Florida between 1992 and 2015. How's that for a sample size? How's that for a longitudinal study? When cared for by white physicians, black newborns were about 3 times more likely to die in the hospital than white newborns, the researchers found. Strikingly, these effects appear to manifest more strongly in more complicated cases, and when hospitals deliver more black newborns, the authors wrote. The findings suggest that black physicians outperform their white colleagues when caring for black newborns. The authors did not speculate about the reasons behind the trend, but wrote, which is I get it. Okay, let's just read this. But wrote, taken with this work, it gives warrant for hospitals and other care organizations to invest in efforts to reduce such biases and explore their connection to institutional racism. Which is yeah, of course, but it goes so much farther beyond that. Just on a quick, hey, here's a quick one. Give us Medicare for all and democratize the availability of healthcare. Give egalitarian funding to different healthcare organizations. Don't allow for private hospitals. Create more state hospitals that are well funded. I can't believe I know that the problems of racism and racial disparities go to the core of our political economic system, but to just isolate it to whether or not a hospital has, I don't even know how you do that. I mean, it's myopic is what I'm saying. Reducing racial disparities in newborn mortality will also require raising awareness among physicians, nurses, and hospital administrators about the prevalence of racial and ethnic disparities, the researchers added. Yeah, I mean, but, as we've learned from nearly every fucking initiative that a state has done in the last whatever, awareness doesn't do enough. You need to create justice. Right? I mean, equality is not even justice. Justice is making recompense. Justice is making something right. Justice is reparations, right? Equality is not enough because that doesn't change what has happened already. I think if we can insert here Malcolm X talking about a really great metaphor about being stabbed and how he thought justice was.
I will never say that progress is being made. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. You pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And they haven't even begun to pull a knife out, much less try and heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there.
It's already known that black infants have 2.3 times the infant mortality rate as white infants, according to the United States Department of Health and Human Services Office for Minority Health, and a report from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which covered the period between 2000 and 2017 and was published in June, found that black infants still have more than twice the risk of dying as white infants. Wow, that's hard to read. I think one thing that this illustrates to me as I'm reading this, and I was kind of remembering, there was a clip here, which maybe we can insert, about Ben Shapiro, that was Ben Shapiro on Joe Rogan talking about the responsibility of an adult, of a person of color. And it was just an interesting exchange. Let's play this now.
The way to fight against that is to make good decisions. And so you fight against the system to make sure that the system has rules that apply equally to everyone.
Right, but you clearly see that there's a big difference between people coming over here willingly and doing so in order to better their lives versus someone whose ancestors were dragged over here to be sold as property, and then dealing with the repercussions of that being your family history. And red line laws and all the other things that were put in place to sort of keep them in very specific areas, which to this day remain crime-ridden, gang-ridden, deeply impoverished communities.
Well, that's true, but the question is how much of that is historic redlining and how much of that is an 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody?
But how much of that 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is based on him growing up in this fucked up environment where that's what he models, where everything around him is crime and gangs, and you imitate your atmosphere, which is what all humans do.
Right, but the answer is there's only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I don't really have any affection for Joe Rogan, obviously, and because he's just giving a mouthpiece to the fucking fascists. But, you know, and Ben Shapiro here is parroting a talking point, which I think is really important, and which is why this story really stuck out for me, which is conservatives and liberals and fascists and whatever will, as we've talked about on the program a lot, they never make any structural critiques. Right? They never say like, oh, you know, this person is a result of these circumstances, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. They always look at personal choice, and they look at it as if you are the sum of your individual decisions in a vacuum. A, it's intellectually dishonest, and B, it's morally dishonest, because the way that I like to think about it is this. In our lives, it's like we're swimming in the ocean, but there's a strong current. And yes, we can go kind of forward, back, side to side a little bit and kind of influence our direction of travel, but ultimately, we're going where that current is pushing us. As much as we like to think that we have our agency and free will, like we are a result of our nature and nurture, and, you know, we're probably going to be very similar to our origins unless we make this unbelievable individual change. The point is to divorce your personal situations from your politico-economic garden in which you were tilled and grew up, and the socioeconomic factors that exist for you. It pisses me the fuck off when somebody says like, oh, well, they made bad choices, or they did drugs, or they committed a crime or something like that. It's such bullshit. The reason I bring this up, and the reason that I wanted to play that clip, is because A, it's just bullshit what Ben Shapiro is positing there, because when we look at this, the statistical representation that whether or not you even live or die past your own birth is influenced by the race of the doctor performing that birth. How could you possibly fucking argue that it is your decisions or your bad choices that create your lot in life when you can't even get out the gate because of your race? I really don't have much more to say on that. It's just, I read this and I've been thinking about it for 24 hours since I read this. It's a failure of humanity is what it is. We can say it's a failure of policy, and it's a failure of Medicare for all and not being here yet and stuff like that. But it goes so deep to the core of our organization and as a species. It sickens me to the core, and I'm sure you're feeling the same way that I am when listening to that. Starting to question whether or not it was a good idea to leave this one for last, because it might have been nice to hear something a little bit more uplifting, but this is Eat the Rich, so, you guys know what you paid for. Anyway, keep this with you and keep these feelings of fervency and urgency with yourself as we move along with our day, and remember to stay sharp and, most importantly, stay cool, folks. Till next time.